The reflection in the studio glass told two different stories. James Brown saw a 40-year-old man trying to capture lightning one more time, sweat-soaked and desperate, chasing a sound that kept dissolving the moment his voice touched it. The band saw the hardest-working man in show business, finally, visibly, running on empty. Both reflections were true. Both reflections were lies. Because what was really happening in that Cincinnati studio had nothing to do with age or exhaustion or even the music itself. It had to do with the weight of being first. First to scream soul into existence. First to bend rhythm until it became religion. First to transform Black American pain into something so powerful that white teenagers and Black revolutionaries and studio musicians worldwide would spend the next 50 years trying to decode it. James had stopped the recording. He'd waved off the band. He'd turned to face the wall, and for 30 seconds, nobody breathed. Then Bobby Byrd, who'd known James since before the fame and the hits and the Cape routine made him untouchable, spoke 6 words into the silence. And James Brown turned around, and funk was born. Before we dive deeper into that moment, if you want to discover more untold stories about the legends who shaped music history, hit that subscribe button. This is where real stories meet real music. Cincinnati in August 1970 felt like the inside of a pressure cooker. The studio on 7th Street wasn't designed for the kind of marathon sessions James Brown demanded, and after 14 hours of recording, the air conditioning had given up entirely. But the heat wasn't what made the session unbearable. It was the silence between takes, growing longer each time James stopped the band, that told everyone something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't about perfecting a song. This was about a man standing at the edge of something he couldn't name, trying to pull the future through his voice while everything he'd built threatened to collapse behind him. James Brown had spent the past 5 years revolutionizing Black American music. After the success of Papa's Got a Brand New Bag in 1965, he'd systematically dismantled everything people understood about rhythm, about soul, about what a voice could do when it stopped trying to be pretty and started trying to be true. He'd placed the emphasis on the one, that first beat of every measure, turning the entire rhythmic foundation of popular music inside out. He'd transformed his voice into a percussion instrument, using screams and grunts and staccato phrases that made producers uncomfortable, made dancers lose their minds. He'd built the JBs into the tightest, most innovative funk band on the planet. And now, in this sweltering Cincinnati studio, he couldn't hear the next step. The session had started promisingly enough. James had come in with rough sketches for 3 new tracks, each one pushing further into the territory he'd been exploring since Sex Machine earlier that year. The band had laid down solid grooves, Maceo Parker's saxophone cutting through the mix with that signature bite, the drums locked into patterns that should have worked. But every time they played it back, James would shake his head, wave his hand, and say it again. It ain't there yet. After the 7th time, the horn section started exchanging glances. After the 12th, even Fred Wesley, who'd arranged some of James's most complex charts, looked lost. And after the 15th time, James stopped the take and stood staring at the wall. Bobby Byrd knew they'd crossed into dangerous territory. Bobby Byrd's history with James Brown stretched back to a moment most people had forgotten, but both men carried it like a scar that had healed into something stronger than regular skin. It was 1952, and James was locked up in the Alto Reform School in Georgia, serving time for armed robbery. He was 19 years old, angry at everything, and certain his life had already been written by the poverty and racism that had shaped every day since his mother walked out when he was 4. Then Bobby Byrd showed up with a gospel group to perform for the inmates. James sang along from his cell, and Bobby heard something that made him stop mid-song. After the performance, Bobby went back, started talking to James, kept coming back. And when James got paroled in 1952, it was Bobby's family who took him in. Bobby who introduced him to music as something more than just sound. Bobby who saw the hunger in James to become something nobody expected. They'd formed the famous Flames together, Bobby's smooth harmonies balancing James's raw power. And they'd ground their way through every Chitlin circuit venue in the South until Federal Records took a chance on Please, Please, Please in 1956. Even after James became the star and Bobby stepped back into a supporting role, The understanding between them remained unbroken. Bobby knew how James thought, how he heard music, how the desperate need to prove something drove every decision he made. And sitting in that Cincinnati studio, watching James unravel in slow motion, Bobby understood that this wasn't about the music being wrong. This was about James being terrified that he'd reached the limit of what he could create. But Bobby also knew something James had forgotten in the heat and exhaustion and pills that were keeping him upright after 14 hours. He knew that James Brown's genius wasn't about having all the answers. It was about being brave enough to step into the space where the answers didn't exist yet. The weight James carried into that studio wasn't just about this album or this session. It was about being the man who'd opened doors that couldn't be closed again, who'd shown an entire generation of black musicians that they could own their sound, their business, their destiny. He'd founded his own label, Try Me Records, back in 1963, when most artists didn't even understand publishing rights. He'd fought for creative control when record companies treated black artists like replaceable products. He'd used his platform during the chaos after Martin Luther King's assassination, performing that legendary free concert in Boston that literally helped prevent a city from burning. Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud had become an anthem that meant everything and terrified people in power. James Brown wasn't just making music. He was making statements that changed how people moved, thought, lived. And now the world was watching to see what he'd do next. The pressure of innovation, of constantly being ahead, of never being allowed to rest or repeat himself without people saying he'd lost it, had built up until it felt like something physical pressing on his chest. Every artist fears irrelevance. But for James, who'd clawed his way up from nothing and knew exactly how fast nothing could take you back, the fear was something darker. It was the knowledge that the moment you stop pushing forward, the world moves on without you. Watching someone great struggle is different from watching someone ordinary fail. When James waved off another take and sat down heavily on the studio floor, his back against the wall, his head in his hands, the band didn't see weakness. They saw the cost of genius. Because genius isn't a gift that arrives and stays. It's something you have to fight for every single day. And some days, the fight takes more than you've got left. The engineers in the control booth had started making excuses to step out for smoke breaks. The horn section was quietly packing up, assuming the session was over, even though nobody had officially called it. James's road manager stood in the doorway, uncertain whether to intervene or disappear. This was the kind of moment that could end careers, could become the story people whispered about when they talked about artists who burned too bright and left nothing but ash. And Bobby Byrd, sitting at his organ with his hands folded in his lap, knew that if he let this moment pass without acting, he'd spend the rest of his life wondering what might have been. The truth about creative partnerships is that they're built on 1,000 small moments of courage that nobody else sees. The times when one person holds the vision steady while the other person falls apart. The times when belief has to be big enough for both people until the one who's lost can find their way back. Bobby had been that person for James, more times than anyone knew, had talked him off ledges both literal and metaphorical, had reminded him who he was when the world got too loud and the pressure got too heavy. But this felt different. This felt like James was standing at a crossroads that would define not just this album, but everything that came after. Bobby Byrd stood up from his organ. The movement was slow, deliberate, and every person in that studio turned to watch. He walked across the recording space, his footsteps loud in the silence, until he stood directly in front of James Brown. And then Bobby leaned down, put his hand on James's shoulder, and spoke 6 words that cut through 14 hours of failure and frustration and fear like sunlight through storm clouds. You already know what it is. The silence that followed those words felt alive. James looked up at Bobby, and for a moment, something passed between them that had nothing to do with music and everything to do with the 19 years they'd spent building something together. Bobby wasn't telling James what to play. He wasn't offering a solution or a new direction. He was reminding James of something fundamental, something that had been true since that first day in the alto reform school when Bobby heard a voice that made him stop singing his own song. James Brown didn't chase sounds. James Brown created them. And the sound he was chasing now wasn't out there waiting to be captured. It was already inside him, had always been inside him. waiting for him to trust it enough to let it out. James stood up. He walked back to the microphone. He signaled to the band with a single gesture that made every musician snap back to attention. And then, without explanation, without a count-off, without any of the usual James Brown precision that had defined every session for years, he started making a sound that nobody in that room had ever heard before. What came out of James Brown in the next 40 minutes would become the foundation of an album that changed music forever. But in that moment, it just sounded like chaos breaking into pattern. James started with his voice, but not singing words, just rhythmic vocalizations that marked time and space and feeling. The drummer picked it up instinctively, laying down a groove that was simpler than anything they'd played all day, just the one, over and over, with small variations that made it breathe. Maceo's horn came in next, short stabs that punctuated rather than carried the melody. Fred Wesley added texture, colors that filled spaces without taking over. And Bobby, back at his organ, played sparse, minimal parts that supported everything without announcing themselves. James started singing actual lyrics. But they weren't the polished verses he'd brought into the session. They were fragments, observations, commands, celebrations, all flowing together in a stream that felt like it was being invented in real time, because it was. This wasn't composition in the traditional sense. This was channeling. James had stopped trying to construct the perfect song and started letting something primal and true move through him. And because the JBs were the most intuitive band in music, they followed him into that space without hesitation, each musician adding exactly what was needed and nothing more. The engineers in the booth scrambled to capture what was happening, adjusting levels on the fly, terrified they'd miss something crucial. This wasn't like recording a planned arrangement. This was like documenting lightning. And everyone in that building understood, even in the moment, that they were witnessing something that would ripple forward through time. Hip-hop producers decades later would spend entire careers sampling these grooves, chopping up these rhythms, building entire genres on the foundation of what James Brown created in a sweaty Cincinnati studio after Bobby Byrd reminded him of the only truth that mattered. You don't find genius. You trust it. The recordings from that session and the subsequent weeks became the core of multiple releases that defined the early 70s. But more importantly, they established a template that every funk, disco, and hip-hop artist would follow. James had broken through to something essential, something that couldn't be unlearned once people heard it. The emphasis on rhythm over melody, the use of voice as percussion, the space between notes being as important as the notes themselves, all of it crystallized in those recordings. And it happened because Bobby Byrd understood that sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone is remind them of what they already know. The relationship between James and Bobby would grow more complicated in the years that followed. Creative partnerships rarely survive success without friction, and both men would eventually go their separate ways, Bobby pursuing his own solo career, while James continued pushing into new territory. But that moment in Cincinnati remained between them, unspoken but understood. Bobby had seen James at his lowest point and hadn't offered sympathy or solutions. He'd offered truth, and James had trusted that truth enough to let go of control and discover what existed on the other side of fear. When hip-hop producers started building beats in the 80s and 90s, they kept coming back to James Brown recordings from this era. The funky drummer break, the payback groove, the rhythmic patterns that seemed simple on the surface but contained infinite complexity underneath. All of it could trace its lineage back to the moment when James stopped trying to create perfect music and started making honest music. The difference between those two things is vast. Perfect music tries to meet expectations. Honest music creates new possibilities. Every sample, every breakbeat, every time a producer chopped up a James Brown record and built something new, they were standing on the foundation of that Cincinnati session. They were benefiting from Bobby Byrd's wisdom and James Brown's courage to trust it. They were proof that the most important innovations don't come from having all the answers. They come from being willing to step into the unknown with nothing but belief that there's something worth finding on the other side. But the story doesn't end with triumph, because real stories never do. James Brown continued pushing himself and everyone around him with a relentlessness that created incredible music and destroyed relationships. His personal life remained chaotic, marked by failed marriages, legal troubles, struggles with addiction that would eventually lead to consequences nobody wanted to see. The same drive that made him revolutionary made him difficult, sometimes cruel, always demanding more than seemed humanly possible. The pills that kept him recording for 14 hours straight eventually took their toll. The need to always be first, always be innovative, always prove something, created a pressure that never released. Bobby Byrd watched from a distance as James's later years became a mix of celebration and tragedy. The Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award in 1992 recognized what everyone already knew: that James Brown had fundamentally changed American music. But the arrests, the health problems, the ways that age and addiction caught up with someone who'd spent a lifetime outrunning both, those were harder to witness. When James died on Christmas Day 2006 from heart failure, Bobby was among those who mourned not just the loss of a legend, but the loss of a friend he'd known for 54 years, since that day in the Alto Reform School when everything changed. The story of those 6 words in a Cincinnati studio matters because it's about more than music. It's about the moments when we forget what we're capable of, when fear and pressure and exhaustion convince us that we've reached the end of what we can create. Those moments come for everyone, whether you're revolutionizing American music or just trying to make it through another difficult day. And in those moments, we need someone who knows us well enough to cut through the noise and remind us of the truth we've forgotten. You already know what it is. 6 words that unlocked an entire album, that changed the trajectory of multiple genres, that proved the power of trust between 2 people who'd spent nearly 2 decades building something together. Bobby Byrd didn't solve James Brown's problem. He reminded James that the problem wasn't lack of talent or inspiration or ability. The problem was doubt. And doubt dissolves in the presence of someone who believes in you completely, who's earned the right to speak truth, who knows that sometimes the most important thing you can offer another person is permission to trust themselves. The music that came from that session continues echoing forward. Every time someone drops a beat that emphasizes the one, every time a voice treats rhythm as seriously as melody, every time a producer samples a James Brown record and builds something new, they're standing in the wake of that moment when doubt transformed into trust and trust transformed into creation. This is how innovation actually works. Not through solitary genius figuring everything out alone, but through relationships deep enough to hold someone steady when they can't hold themselves. James Brown and Bobby Byrd's partnership created some of the most influential music of the 20th century. But the real's legacy isn't the records or the samples or the awards. It's the reminder that genius needs support, that innovation requires trust, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can say to someone struggling to create is simple and true. You already know what it is. You always did. And the moment you stop doubting that knowledge, there's no limit to what you can build.